The hall was buzzing with quiet excitement, the kind of energy that made the wooden floors hum under the footsteps of the people who were gathering. It was one of those evenings when everyone in town seemed to be walking toward the same place, each carrying their own anticipation and curiosity. They had all heard whispers of the young musician who had been practicing in the small, sunlit room above the town's little music store. No one knew exactly what to expect tonight, but there was a feeling in the air, an unspoken promise that something unusual, something remarkable, was about to happen. The musician had been preparing for this moment for months. Each day, from dawn until late at night, their fingers moved across the keys of the piano in a rhythm that had become almost instinctive. The piece was not just a collection of notes. It was a story, a memory, a fragment of something deeply personal that they wanted to share with the world. The music had started as a quiet whisper in their heart, a melody that seemed to appear in dreams and linger in quiet moments. Now, it was ready to bloom, to reach the ears and hearts of everyone in the hall. Backstage, the mood was tense. The organizers were not entirely supportive. Some of them had begun to doubt whether this performance was suitable for the evening's program. They whispered among themselves, exchanging uncertain glances. "It doesn't really fit the theme," one of them said, trying to sound reasonable. "Maybe we should ask them to play something else," another suggested. They didn't understand the depth of what the musician wanted to express. They only saw the risks, the possibility that the performance might not meet the audience's expectations. But the musician had made up their mind. They could feel the weight of every hour spent practicing, every note memorized, every emotion woven into the music. Nothing could stop them now. The young musician stepped forward, carrying a mixture of nervousness and determination. Their hands hovered over the keys, a silent promise to themselves and to the piece they had nurtured for so long. They could hear the murmurs behind the curtains, soft arguments about whether to continue or not, but they chose to focus on the music. The first note hovered in the air, delicate and fragile like the flutter of a bird's wing, and then, slowly, the melody began to unfold. From the first sound, there was a shift in the room. People turned their heads, ears straining, hearts adjusting to the unexpected. There was no dramatic flourish, no attempt to grab attention with noise or speed. It was simple, honest, heartfelt. Each note seemed to tell a story, reaching out to anyone who was willing to listen. The musician played as if the piano were an extension of their own soul, each movement of the fingers carrying intention, care, and vulnerability. The audience, at first quiet and polite, started to lean forward in their seats. There was an undercurrent of surprise in their expressions. They had expected something standard, something that fit neatly into the evening's schedule. Instead, they were receiving a glimpse into someone's inner world. It was personal and raw, yet universally understandable. The notes spoke of memories, of small joys and hidden sorrows, of moments that everyone had experienced in some form, but rarely found expressed so beautifully. The music did not demand applause. It demanded attention, reflection, and connection. Backstage, the tension did not fully disappear. Some organizers still whispered, concerned that the performance was taking a different path than planned. They moved closer, preparing to intervene if necessary. But even their own expressions softened as they watched the audience respond. The murmur of approval, the gentle leaning forward, the nods of recognition began to outweigh their initial doubts. Something was happening that no one had anticipated. The music, fragile and determined, was taking control of the room. The young musician closed their eyes, feeling the hall, the people, and the moment. Each note became a bridge between their world and the listeners' hearts. They could sense the subtle shifts, the way some people's eyes glistened, the way others held their breath, caught in a story that was not spoken but deeply felt. The piano keys were not just instruments. They were storytellers, carrying messages of hope, courage, and unspoken truth. There was no rush, no need to impress. Every pause, every gentle touch of a key was deliberate and meaningful. Outside, in the quiet streets leading to the hall, people had gathered, drawn by curiosity and word of mouth. Some were late, shuffling in with coats still dusted by the evening chill. They did not know exactly what they were stepping into, but the faint strains of the piano reached them even before they entered. There was a subtle magic in the air, a reminder that sometimes art could break barriers and create moments of unexpected wonder. Inside, the audience's reaction grew more visible. Small smiles appeared, tears glimmered in the corner of eyes, and a few whispered to neighbors about how they could feel every emotion in the melody. The music was quiet in its power, but undeniable. It moved through the hall like a gentle river, touching each person differently, yet leaving everyone changed in some way. It was not about grandeur or spectacle. It was about truth, about honesty, about the courage to share something fragile and precious in front of strangers and friends alike. The young musician felt a shift within themselves, too. The initial nerves melted into a calm determination. They realized that they were not playing just for themselves, but for the countless small connections forming in that hall at that very moment. The music was no longer a solitary creation. It was a living conversation with everyone present. Each note carried an echo of laughter, a shadow of sorrow, a spark of hope. The performer and the audience became intertwined, sharing a rare and fleeting unity that could not be predicted or planned. And then came a moment when time seemed to slow. A particularly delicate passage demanded every ounce of attention. Fingers danced across the keys with precision, yet with warmth and feeling. It was a passage that the musician had practiced countless times, yet tonight it was alive, spontaneous, and full of emotion. The hall seemed to breathe in unison, caught in the rhythm of a story told without words. Hearts beat faster, breaths held, and even the skeptics backstage found themselves captivated, unsure whether to intervene or simply watch the unfolding beauty. For those listening, it felt as though the world had narrowed to the hall, to the music, to the piano, and to the young person who had dared to share a piece of their soul. The notes carried memories of childhood, echoes of forgotten dreams, whispers of love and longing. Each person in the audience experienced something slightly different, yet all were united in awe and admiration. It was a reminder of how profoundly music could speak when given the chance. As the first part of the piece came to an end, there was a soft silence. It was not the end of attention, but a moment of reflection, of collective holding of breath. People looked at each other, sharing a wordless acknowledgement that something extraordinary had just occurred. The music had started a conversation that words could not capture, and everyone felt privileged to witness it. The young musician opened their eyes slowly, seeing faces transformed by emotion, by surprise, by connection. There was relief, yes, but also a deep sense of accomplishment. They had trusted their instincts and their preparation, and the audience had responded in kind, even as they took a small pause, preparing for the next segment of the performance. The tension from earlier backstage arguments seemed to dissipate. The organizers could no longer deny the impact of the music. The young musician had proven that sometimes, following one's heart, even in the face of doubt or opposition, could create moments that linger far longer than fear or hesitation. The hall, still quiet, seemed to hum with the memory of the first notes, each listener carrying the melody forward in their own minds. The performance had begun, but more than that, a subtle magic had been unleashed. People would remember this evening not just for the music itself, but for the courage it represented, the vulnerability displayed, and the simple truth that passion, honesty, and dedication could overcome obstacles. And for the young musician, this was only the beginning of a night that promised even more moments of surprise, emotion, and unforgettable connection. The hall was ready, the audience was ready, and the music, unstoppable now, was ready to continue its journey. Backstage, the tension was rising once again. Some of the organizers still whispered among themselves, worried that the musician might continue in a way that seemed unpredictable. They were unsure if the audience would appreciate what was about to happen. The young musician could hear the faint rustle of papers, the quiet shuffling of feet, and the occasional murmur of dissent. But they had made a choice. They would not be stopped. The music had become larger than the doubts, larger than the rules, larger than the fear of judgment. The musician glanced at the audience, who were still seated, their eyes filled with curiosity and anticipation. Some were smiling, some had their heads tilted slightly, listening with intensity. The first notes had already captured their attention, and now the young performer was ready to continue. There was a sense of urgency in the air, but also a sense of calm. Every person in the hall seemed to be waiting for the next sound, for the next wave of emotion to sweep through them. A soft spotlight shone on the piano, highlighting the musicians' hands as they moved with care and precision. The first melody had been delicate, almost fragile, but now the music began to grow in confidence and depth. Each note carried intention, telling a story that had no words. It was a story of perseverance, of hope, of moments that are easily forgotten but deserve to be remembered. The audience leaned in, sensing that they were part of something special, something rare. Behind the curtains, the organizers grew anxious. One of them stepped forward, intending to stop the performance, to suggest a change, to redirect the evening. But before they could speak, the music seemed to swell and wrap around the room, creating a presence that could not be ignored. Melody had a weight to it now, a quiet insistence that demanded attention. The young musician's fingers moved swiftly and confidently, yet with a gentleness that drew people closer rather than pushing them away. It was impossible to resist. Even the skeptics paused, realizing that trying to intervene now would feel almost wrong. The audience responded in subtle ways at first. Some shifted in their seats, their posture straightening as they absorbed the sound. Some closed their eyes, allowing the music to wash over them, while others whispered softly to neighbors about how unusual and beautiful the performance was. The atmosphere in the hall transformed. What had been polite curiosity became engagement, and engagement began to feel like shared awe. Everyone was participating in one way or another. In the story that unfolded on the piano, the young musician noticed these reactions and felt a surge of energy. It was not just their talent or skill at work, it was the connection, the recognition that the music was touching lives in real time. Each note was a bridge, linking hearts and minds. It did not rush. They allowed the melody to breathe, to pause and reflect, to linger in the spaces between notes. There was an intimacy in these pauses, a moment for the audience to feel the weight of each emotion, each subtle nuance of the piece. Backstage, arguments quieted as even the most doubtful organizers realized that something extraordinary was happening. They could see the audience responding, could feel the room's energy shifting. The young musician had taken control of the moment, not by force, but by authenticity. Every key pressed was a testament to hours of practice, to dedication, and to a willingness to share something deeply personal. The hall was no longer just a venue. It was a living, breathing participant in the music. Outside the hall, people who had not yet entered paused as they heard the faint strains of the piano. It drew them closer, step by step, until they were at the doors, listening with curiosity and amazement. Word spread quickly in whispers something remarkable was happening inside. The young musician's performance was no longer confined to the walls of the hall. It had begun to reach beyond, touching those who had come late, or who had only just heard the first few notes. The music was creating its own gravity, pulling people in, demanding attention and respect. Inside the hall seemed almost magical. The young musician had reached a section of the piece that was both powerful and tender. Their hands moved with precision, but the emotion behind each note was visible in the slight tremor of their fingers, in the way their eyes occasionally closed to fully feel the music. The audience responded instinctively. Some clutched their chests, feeling emotions rise within them. Some wiped away tears they hadn't realized had come. Others simply sat in quiet amazement, soaking in every moment. The music had become a dialogue, unspoken yet deeply understood. The organizers, who had been so concerned about rules and expectations, now found themselves watching helplessly, caught in a mixture of admiration and surprise. They had tried to control the moment, to shape it to fit a plan, but the music was beyond control. It was free, alive, and demanding to be felt. They could see the impact on the audience, could feel the room's energy vibrating with unspoken acknowledgement. What they had feared as disorder or mistake had become a beautiful revelation. The young musician felt a wave of relief mixed with exhilaration. The fear of being stopped, the anxiety of breaking expectations, had transformed into a sense of purpose and power. Each note was a declaration: I will play, I will share, and this music matters. The melody was no longer just a song. It was a statement, a bridge between the musician and everyone listening. It connected strangers, brought attention to emotions long hidden, and reminded people of the simple, unshakable truth that art can move hearts like nothing else. As the performance continued, the musician experimented with subtle variations in the rhythm, introducing gentle pauses and changes in tempo. It was a delicate balance, requiring focus and emotional intuition. The audience responded to these nuances instinctively, leaning in or holding their breath, experiencing the music not just as sound, but as an immersive, shared experience. Some whispered to each other, commenting on the unexpected beauty, while others simply closed their eyes, allowing the performance to transport them to another place entirely. There was a moment when a particularly soft and intimate section of the piece began. The young musician's hands barely touched the keys, yet the sound that emerged was full of depth and emotion. It was as if the piano itself was speaking directly to each person in the room. The audience became completely silent, every sound of movement or breath hushed in reverence. This was not just a performance anymore. It was a collective experience, a fragile and fleeting moment where time seemed to pause, leaving only music and emotion. Even the skeptics backstage could no longer deny the power of what they were witnessing. The organizers, who had feared chaos or disappointment, now felt a deep sense of respect and wonder. They watched as the musician poured their heart into every note, realizing that their initial fears had been misplaced. The music could not be stopped. It could not be ignored. It had taken on a life of its own, demanding attention and admiration from all who were present. Outside, the small crowd that had gathered in the streets grew larger. People who had not intended to attend the event were drawn by the sound, by the curiosity, and by the whispers of those who had already been inside. The music was spreading, quietly, invisibly, but powerfully. It created anticipation, excitement, and a sense of community that went beyond the walls of the hall. The young musician, focused entirely on the piano, did not notice this growing audience yet, but the effect of their dedication and courage was beginning to ripple outward. Inside, the audience's emotions intensified. They were no longer simply listening. They were participating in the story that unfolded with every note. The young musician's choices, the soft dynamics, the sudden crescendos, the careful pacing felt intentional, deliberate, and deeply human. It was not about technical perfection or impressing others. It was about honesty, vulnerability, and the courage to be seen and heard. Each person in the hall recognized that courage in their own way, feeling inspired and connected. By the middle of the piece, the music had taken a life of its own. The young musician was no longer thinking about fear or doubt. They were thinking only about the story they wanted to tell and the connection they wanted to make. The audience responded naturally, their reactions forming a subtle dialogue with the performance. Some nodded in rhythm, some whispered soft encouragements, and others simply allowed themselves to be carried by the emotion, their hearts open and attentive. The tension from earlier backstage disagreements had completely dissolved. The organizers now watched in awe, realizing that trying to stop the musician would have been a mistake. The power of the music, the authenticity of the performance, the connection it created could not be contained or controlled. It was a living, breathing thing that had found its way into the hearts of everyone present. The young musician had turned potential conflict into a moment of shared wonder. As the first major section of the piece drew to a close, there was a pause, a moment of quiet reflection. The audience, still caught in the magic of what they had experienced, shared glances of understanding, of admiration, of awe. The young musician allowed themselves a small smile, a brief acknowledgement that the risk had been worth it. They had faced doubt, fear, and opposition, yet their courage had created something unforgettable. The music, unstoppable and alive, had found its way into every corner of the hall, touching lives in ways that words could never capture. The performance was far from over, but the foundation had been laid. The audience was fully engaged, ready to follow wherever the music would lead next. The young musician felt a sense of calm determination, knowing that they were not alone. The hall, the people, and the moment itself were part of a larger story. Now, a story of bravery, honesty, and the transformative power of music. And as the next notes began to flow, delicate and precise, it was clear that nothing could stop what had already begun. The hall was completely alive now. Every person in the audience felt the music in a different way, yet everyone shared a quiet acknowledgement that something remarkable was happening. The young musician's hands moved with growing confidence across the keys. Each note was deliberate, thoughtful, and filled with emotion. They did not play for recognition or applause, but to honor the story that had taken root in their heart and now flowed through the piano into the hall. From the moment the first note was struck, a subtle transformation had begun. People were leaning forward, closing their eyes, swaying slightly, or just holding still to absorb the sound. Some faces showed tears, others smiles, and some were simply expressions of awe. The music had become a bridge, connecting strangers and friends alike, creating a shared experience that was quiet but profound. The young musician could feel the energy in the room and allowed it to guide their performance. Each phrase was longer, more expressive, filled with layers of feeling that could be heard and felt simultaneously. Backstage, those who had tried to stop the performance were now frozen in observation. They had expected disinterest, confusion, or even rejection from the audience. Instead, they saw hearts opening, minds engaging, and eyes reflecting the beauty of what was unfolding. Their earlier doubts melted away, replaced by admiration. The young musician had transformed the hall, had transformed the moment, with nothing more than passion, talent, and honesty. There was no denying the power of what they had created. Even the organizers, once concerned, now understood that this was no ordinary performance. It was a declaration of courage and humanity. The music began to take on new shapes. The young musician experimented with gentle pauses, sudden bursts of intensity, and intricate movements that were both challenging and captivating. The audience responded instinctively, leaning into the shifts, holding their breath, letting out soft sighs as the sound flowed around them. It was a conversation without words, a silent dialogue where every note mattered, where every subtle change could shift emotions and perceptions. This was music not just to listen to, but to feel in the very core of one's being. Outside, the soft glow of the streetlights reflected on windows, and some people paused. Hearing the faint strains of the piano even from a distance, word of the performance had begun to spread quietly through the streets. Those who had not planned to attend felt drawn toward the hall. The music itself seemed to call them, creating curiosity, anticipation, and a sense of community. The young musician remained unaware of the growing audience outside, but the effect of their art was rippling far beyond the walls of the hall, inside. The hall was nearly silent except for the piano's voice. The young musician's face showed concentration, emotion, and a quiet joy. This was not a performance about perfection, but about connection. Every note had meaning, and the audience recognized it. Some whispered softly to themselves, recalling personal memories stirred by the melody. Others were quiet, completely immersed, feeling emotions that had been long forgotten or rarely acknowledged. It was impossible to predict who would respond in what way, but everyone was responding. The music had found a way to speak to each heart differently, yet uniformly. The young musician reached a particularly challenging section. It required not only technical skill, but emotional courage. Fingers moved faster, yet never lost warmth or purpose. The room seemed to hold its breath. Every listener felt the subtle tension, the rise and fall of sound that mirrored human emotion. Some audience members closed their eyes, feeling themselves transported. Others watched the pianist's hands, captivated by the skill and the story being told in every movement. There was no distraction, no noise, just the full, immersive power of music and emotion combined. The organizers could no longer think in terms of rules or programs. Their role had shifted from control to witness. They saw what courage and authenticity could do. They watched the young musician defy expectation, overcoming fear and potential opposition with nothing but focus and honesty. It was clear that stopping this performance would have been unimaginable. The music had become unstoppable, alive, and undeniable. The power of passion and dedication had transformed a moment that might have been ordinary into something extraordinary. A soft hush spread across the hall as the music slowed and became more delicate. This was the part where the melody seemed to speak directly to the heart. The young musician leaned into the piano, feeling the notes vibrate under their fingers. The audience responded instinctively. Some leaned closer, some whispered in awe to the person next to them, and some simply remained silent, letting the sound wash over them. The music was intimate now, personal, yet shared. It was a moment of vulnerability, honesty. It's an unspoken communication that transcended words. The quiet intensity of this section allowed emotions to surface. A few people wiped tears from their eyes, others smiled knowingly, and many felt a strange sense of recognition, as if the music had touched parts of themselves they had never allowed to be felt openly. The young musician noticed the small reactions, the shifts in posture, the glances exchanged among audience members. Each reaction reinforced the connection, the shared experience, and the profound impact of authenticity. The melody grew again, building in layers and complexity. The young musician navigated each transition with care, mixing gentle passages with moments of dramatic intensity. The hall responded in unison. Soft murmurs of appreciation, faint sighs, and the collective holding of breath created an almost tangible energy that pulsed in the room. Each note was more than sound. It was a message, a feeling, a story. Every person in the audience felt it differently. Yet, everyone was united in awe and admiration. Outside, the crowd had grown. People who had come late or had been walking by paused to listen. Some had never been interested in music, yet even they felt drawn in by the notes that spilled into the streets. The young musician's performance had begun to resonate beyond the hall, affecting people who had not expected to be moved. The music's reach was growing, quietly, steadily, yet powerfully. It was clear that this was no ordinary evening, no ordinary performance. Something extraordinary was unfolding, and it was impossible to ignore. Inside, the young musician played with renewed confidence, the earlier tension and fear replaced by a sense of purpose. Every note told a part of the story, and every pause allowed the audience to reflect and feel. The melody now carried subtle variations, gentle flourishes, and unexpected turns that drew listeners even deeper. People found themselves leaning in instinctively, caught in the momentum of sound and emotion. Each phrase was a bridge, connecting hearts, memories, and experiences. It was a living conversation that needed no words. Some audience members began to exchange glances, communicating silently their shared amazement. Even those who had been skeptical, who had questioned whether this performance would be meaningful, now found themselves fully engaged. The music had broken down barriers, dissolved doubt, and invited everyone to participate emotionally. It was a quiet revolution, a shift in perception powered by courage, dedication, and artistic truth. The young musician allowed themselves a brief pause to catch their breath, feeling the room, the people, and the moment. They were aware of the impact, the connection, and the beauty of what was unfolding. There was no need to force the audience to feel. They were already moved, already engaged. Each note, each gesture, each breath became a declaration. This music matters, and so do the feelings it evokes. It was a celebration of authenticity, of human expression, and of the courage to follow one's heart. As the piece continued, the young musician moved through complex passages with skill and care. The audience responded instinctively, their reactions forming an invisible dialogue. Some closed their eyes, lost in memories and emotion. Some leaned forward, captivated by the technical precision and emotional depth. Others whispered softly, sharing their surprise and admiration. Each person experienced the music differently, yet all were united by the profound impact of what they were hearing and feeling. The hall was now completely immersed in the performance. The young musician's courage and authenticity had transformed the space, creating a rare and fragile magic. The organizers, who had once tried to stop the music, now watched silently, filled with awe and respect. They realized that true artistry could not be constrained by rules or fear. The music had taken over, uniting the audience, defying doubt, and leaving an unforgettable impression on everyone present. Finally, the young musician reached another quiet section, allowing the notes to linger in the air. The audience was completely captivated, holding their breath, feeling each sound resonate within them. This moment, though delicate, carried immense power. The connection between performer and listener had deepened, creating a shared experience that would remain in memory long after the final note had faded. The music was no longer just a performance. It had become an emotional journey, a story told through sound, courage, and humanity. As part 3 drew to a close, the young musician felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The hall had been transformed, the audience had been touched, and the impossible had been achieved. Music, passion, and authenticity had overcome fear and doubt, creating a moment that would not soon be forgotten. The performance was far from over, yet the foundation had been laid for what promised to be an unforgettable finale. The hall was alive, the audience fully engaged, and the young musician ready to continue sharing the story that only they could tell. The hall had become a world of its own. The music floated through the air like a gentle wave, wrapping itself around every person present. Each note resonated with emotion, and the young musician continued to play with focus and grace. Their fingers moved quickly and confidently, but with warmth that made every sound feel alive. There was no rush, no attempt to impress. Each note was meant to touch hearts and create a connection that went beyond the surface. The audience was completely engaged. Some leaned forward in their seats, some closed their eyes to feel every vibration, and others sat silently, letting the music wash over them. The transformation was remarkable. Where there had been polite curiosity, now there was full attention and emotional involvement. Even those who had been skeptical, who had doubted the young musician or questioned whether the performance was appropriate, were now captivated, their doubts replaced by admiration and awe. It was clear that this music had a life of its own. It's unstoppable and powerful. Backstage, the organizers had long given up trying to intervene. The young musician's courage and talent had proven that the performance could not be stopped. There was no point in attempting to enforce rules or control the moment. They watched quietly, filled with wonder at what was unfolding. Every reaction in the hall seemed to affirm that this was more than just a performance. It was an emotional journey, a shared experience that united everyone in the room. The young musician felt a surge of energy as they moved into the next section of the piece. This part was complex, requiring skill, focus, and emotional depth. The audience sensed it too, their anticipation growing with each passing note. Fingers danced over the keys with precision, yet each movement carried feeling, vulnerability, and honesty. The hall seemed to hold its breath, absorbing every sound, waiting for the next wave of emotion to emerge. Outside, the soft evening light fell across the streets, and people passing by paused as the music drifted through open windows and doors. Some were curious, drawn in by the beauty and intensity of what they heard. A small crowd gathered outside, listening quietly, as if afraid to interrupt the magic inside. The performance had begun to extend beyond the walls of the hall, touching hearts and stirring emotions in ways no one could have predicted. The young musician was unaware of the growing audience outside, yet the impact of their courage and artistry was already reaching far and wide. Inside, the hall's energy was almost tangible. Each section of the music told a story, evoking memories, emotions, and feelings in the audience. Some people whispered softly, commenting on the beauty or the unexpected depth of the performance. Others remained silent, letting the music speak directly to their hearts. There was a quiet sense of community forming, as strangers shared a rare and intimate moment together. The young musician could feel it too, a sense of connection that made every note more meaningful and every phrase more powerful. The music began to build, rising and falling with a rhythm that mirrored life itself. Gentle passages gave way to crescendos that filled the hall with sound and emotion. The young musician's skill was undeniable, but it was the emotion behind the playing that captivated everyone. The notes were not just sounds. They were stories, feelings, and messages carried from the performer's heart into the hearts of the listeners. People found themselves drawn in, caught in the ebb and flow of the melody, unable to look away or stop listening. Backstage, the organizers whispered among themselves, acknowledging silently that the music had surpassed any expectation. Their earlier concerns and attempts to stop the performance seemed almost trivial now. The young musician had demonstrated that true artistry could not be constrained by rules or doubt. The performance had become a lesson in courage, dedication, and authenticity. It was a reminder that passion and honesty could move people in ways that no rule or guideline ever could. The young musician's hands moved with confidence as the piece reached its most expressive sections. They allowed themselves to become fully absorbed in the music, letting the melody guide their movements and decisions. Each note carried intention, creating a story that was understood intuitively by the audience. People leaned in, held their breath, and closed their eyes to feel the depth of emotion. It was a moment of shared vulnerability, a collective experience that brought everyone closer together. Even without words, some in the audience felt tears rise as the music touched memories they had long kept hidden. Others smiled softly, feeling joy and hope in the delicate passages. The music had the power to make people reflect, to feel deeply, and to connect with themselves and each other. The young musician noticed these reactions and felt a sense of fulfillment and purpose. They were not performing for recognition or reward, but to share something deeply human, something that could not be measured by applause alone. The hall seemed to vibrate with energy as the music continued. People were fully present, absorbed in the performance, yet aware of the shared experience. The young musician moved through the transitions with grace and skill, each phrase flowing naturally into the next. The melody carried a sense of journey, a story unfolding in real time, with highs and lows. Moments of tension and release, and passages of quiet reflection. Every listener was drawn into the narrative, participating in the experience without even realizing it. Outside, more people had gathered, drawn by the sound and the stories shared by those who had already been inside. They listened with quiet reverence, feeling the emotional power of the music even from a distance. The young musician's courage and dedication had created a ripple effect, extending far beyond the hall and touching lives in unexpected ways. The music had become a beacon, drawing people together and inspiring awe. Inside, the young musician reached another quiet, intimate section. The notes were soft, delicate, and full of emotion. The audience responded instinctively, leaning forward, closing their eyes, and feeling the resonance of each sound. The hall was silent except for the piano, yet it was filled with life and emotion. This was a moment of true connection, where a performer and listener shared an experience that transcended words. It was a reminder of the power of art to move, heal, and inspire. The young musician allowed themselves a brief pause, feeling the energy in the room, the reactions of the audience, and the impact of their performance. There was no fear, no doubt, only a sense of purpose and fulfillment. Each note that followed was deliberate, expressive, and full of meaning. The music had become more than a performance. It was a conversation, a shared journey, a story told through sound and emotion. The crescendo began, gentle at first, then growing in intensity. The audience leaned in, caught in the momentum of the music. The young musician played with precision, skill, and emotion, guiding everyone through the story. Some whispered softly, some held their breath, and some simply closed their eyes, allowing themselves to be carried by the melody. The hall had become a living, breathing space of shared experience, and every person in the room felt it. Backstage, the organizers finally allowed themselves to relax. Realizing that the music could not be stopped, the young musician had created something unforgettable, a moment of courage, authenticity, and emotional connection. They watched quietly, filled with awe and respect, as the performance continued to captivate everyone present. It was clear that the music had achieved something extraordinary, something that would remain in the memories of the audience long after the final note had been played. As the young musician moved toward the final sections of the piece, there was a sense of anticipation in the hall. Everyone was aware that the performance had been special, but the ending promised even more. The music rose and fell, carrying emotion, skill, and heart with every note. The audience was fully engaged, participating silently in the journey, their emotions guided by the melody. The young musician played with confidence, grace, and authenticity. Knowing that they had achieved something remarkable, The quiet sections allowed reflection, the crescendos inspired awe, and the melody carried hope, joy, and tenderness. Each note was deliberate, yet alive with feeling. The audience could feel the story, the journey, and the heart behind every sound. This was not a performance that could be measured by applause alone. It was a moment of shared humanity, a connection that transcended rules, doubt, or expectation. The young musician had created magic, and everyone present could feel it.